This is Bonjour Chai, the Brooklyn book banning edition. I'm Avi Feingold, and I'm here with Phoebe Maltzbovy. We are your Frozen Chosen. On today's show, we talk to Joshua Leifer about his new book, Tablets Shattered. We ask him about what happened when a bookstore canceled his talk, and we get into current events in Israel. All this and more coming right up. Just a quick note to remind you that our Sermon Slam is still happening. The third annual Great Canadian Sermon Slam will be coming up before the high holidays this year. If you are a rabbi and hearing this and want to submit a sermon, if you are a congregant and want to submit your rabbi, you want to nominate your rabbi, please email us at bonjour@thecjn.ca to be featured in our Great Canadian Sermon Slam. We'd love to have you part of it. We actually have Joshua Leifer on today. He has a important new book out, Tablets Shattered, and there was a bit of a brouhaha with a bookstore in Brooklyn. We're going to talk to him about that. He got banned because his questioner, the person that he was supposed to be doing the book talk with, was too Zionist. As long as he is Zionist, he was canceled.
Yes, he was deplatformed for, the rabbi was deplatformed for Zionism.
Yes.
Although what we get into in this discussion is who is a Zionist. We revisit that eternal topic.
Of course, and we will actually talk about a lot of current events also. We had a chance to talk to him about, there's a lot of stuff going on in Israel, all these protests. They really have taken over Israel the way that they have a year ago, and they're not really registering here. We're just really talking about the hostages. So let's go to our interview with Joshua Leifer coming right up. Joshua Leifer is a writer and translator. He has written for 972 Magazine Online and Jewish Currents, and he's a PhD candidate at Yale University. Most recently, his book Tablets Shattered, which just came out this month, has been the subject of some controversy after a dust-up at the Powerhouse Arena bookstore, where an event that was scheduled to occur was canceled hours before because his interviewer, Rabbi Andy Bachman, was too Zionist for their taste. Joshua joins us now. Welcome to Bonjour Chai.
Thank you so much for having me.
Can you give us the 30-second summary about what happened that day?
Yeah. In the end, it's actually not so interesting, which is that basically an hour before the event, my publicist gets a call from the bookstore saying there are some concerns about the moderator, that he's a Zionist, and asking me if I can keep the conversation within comfortable parameters. And I said, of course, you know my book. It's a nuanced book. I hope there's nothing to worry about. And then basically, like around even less than a half an hour before the event, I get another call from the publicist saying, now the venue is refusing to host Andy because he's a Zionist. And I said, okay, that's no good. And that's, let me figure out what's actually going on. And I went to the bookstore where I tried to talk to the manager there. And she said very clearly to my face that Andy's a Zionist and we don't want a Zionist on stage. And so that conversation wasn't going to happen.
As somebody who does write about these topics, I'm super interested in this and also was upset by it when I saw that this had happened to you. But one question I had was just about you tweeted about it and said that you had anticipated pushback from synagogues and not from a Brooklyn bookstore. And I wanted you to talk about that a little bit. So expand on that basically.
Yeah. I mean, the reason why I tweeted that is the book it's many things. It's a history of kind of post-war American Jewish life and a reported map of the Jewish present. It also contains some fairly strong criticisms of the direction the Israeli government has taken, and it explores in a kind of critical historical lens how American Jewish identity came to center on Israel. And given my years of reporting from Israel and also from the States about the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, and my kind of vocal opposition to it, I sort of expected that there would be synagogues and what you might call the more mainline or establishment Jewish community might be reticent to host events for the book. And then I was surprised when it seemed like some of the insistence on red lines that I had criticized for many years in the Jewish world were now different kinds of red lines are now being applied in, I guess, I don't know what you could call it, the progressive world, or the world of the literary world. And it definitely, in the moment, I started to feel a sense of, well, where are people like me going to go? Which is to say, where are people who are critical of the Israeli government, but also still committed to some sense of like community of fate with Jewish Israelis. Where are we going at? What platforms do we have left in this moment?
I was curious if the deplatforming that you expected to happen, like any of the snubs you were expecting to happen, actually didn't come through. And were there any surprising invitations to speak or places where you were not expecting there to be spaces for you actually turned out to be spaces?
Yeah, I mean, so I think there are sort of two things that have happened related to that. One is that initially, I really did think that the book was getting a kind of silent boycott on both sides. Part of why we ended up doing the event at Powerhouse was that there weren't other New York City bookstores that were willing to host the event. It was not my first choice. I'd actually never been in that bookstore.
Oh, can I just jump in on that specifically? When you say that didn't want to host, I mean, it's hard to sell books. It's hard to get. When you say refused, was it on political grounds? The other bookstores?
No, I have no idea. I'm now speculating, but it was. Oh, I guess what I'm saying is it was very, very hard to find a place to do the launch event. Harder than I thought would be. Maybe it was August. It's also a controversial topic, but it felt like there were a lot of places that could have been good homes for the book that ended up passing on it. And so that was one part of this. And then of course after the event, lots and lots and lots of people reached out to me, including like there's a certain irony to all of this because, for instance, the Anti-Defamation League reaches out to me, but I've also written very critically of the Anti-Defamation League's canceling of people who I don't think deserve to be canceled for their criticism of Israel. And so there is a kind of part of what was frustrating about the response is that there's not consistency on principle across the political division on this. But also a lot of places that I didn't think I'd ever be able to speak to want me to speak now. Like there are conventional synagogues, for instance, big conservative suburban synagogues, which is sort of ironic because in a lot of ways there's a critique of that kind of suburban Jewish life in the book. And it's what it's lacking in terms of spirituality and community.
And the event did end up taking place and where? Because that was interesting.
Yeah, and so the event ended up taking place at a venue that's called the Center for New Jewish Culture, but which is now part of Congregation Beth Elohim, which is a very large, maybe the biggest Reform congregation in Brooklyn, where Andy Bachman, the moderator, had previously been a rabbi. And there's something kind of funny where the event at Powerhouse Books, only 30 people showed up to that, but 400 people showed up to the event at Beth Elohim. The bookstore wrote a very good apology about what happened, and I'm glad that they wrote that. And I joked that I don't think that the employee who kind of went rogue on this and made this unilateral decision could have foreseen the kind of storm that she catalyzed. I mean, she certainly did not know who Andy Bachman is and did not foresee that something like this is going to happen.
This is leading to two other questions about this, and then I promise we will move on from the incident.
Sure.
It seems like this was in the specifics kind of a one-off, but do you now, or have you been learning more, or did you already know more about like the sort of post-October 7th literary landscape and sort of there's a reason this resonated and seemed familiar, like after what happened with Guernica,
yes,
which we talked about on the show. Do you see this as fitting into something bigger, or do you see this just as kind of like a one-off weird thing that happened?
No, it's obviously part of something larger, which is that in some progressive circles, Israel is so demonized that being either Israeli or connected to Israel through Jewish life or personal background is basically like a disqualifying fact of it's basically disqualifying and is seen as illegitimate, and Israeli identity is seen as illegitimate, and also so is Zionism seen as, but there's no possibility for it to be multifaceted to mean lots of different things. It's just the line is sort of Zionism is fascism, or it's Nazism, or it's white supremacy, and kind of that's been taken and implemented in marching orders, basically. It's also really annoying for someone like me who comes from and kind of immersion in the Israeli left on the one hand, and I've seen my career in a lot of ways as translating the Israeli left from Hebrew into English, and then angle of analysis that it brings, and then basically being told like there's no place for this perspective.
So technically it was your fellow speaker who was the deplatformed Zionist, but I wonder, couldn't you be deplatformed as a Zionist or air quotes Zionist? Like, I mean, I guess, because I know that you were referred to in the Free Press as an anti-Zionist, and that I guess, is not accurate. How do you define yourself with respect to Zionism? And
that article is not accurate. And actually, I emailed the Free Press and they corrected it.
Okay.
And there is a addendum from me below on it. Yeah, I'm not an anti-Zionist, and I never identified myself publicly as an anti-Zionist. I'm an anti-occupation Jew, and you're right that like the capacious definition of Zionism certainly includes me. If Zionism means Jews have the right to collective self-determination, then obviously I'm a Zionist. But
doesn't it? See, that's it's funny because to me, like that's my politics. I think are pretty similar to yours on this, and it seems self-evident to me that I'm a Zionist in part because of the pushback I get from anti-Zionists. And I think this is something we'll talk about later in the conversation, but just I think it depends, who's around you. But do you want to tell us a bit about the book? Because we want to know about the book itself. We have listened to Emily Bazelon interviewing you and read your article in The Atlantic. Not yet read your book, but it's on the list. Yeah, no. So I'd be happy to talk about the book. And I guess I was just going to say one more thing to really stress that I'm not an anti-Zionist. It's been a very frustrating thing. Sure, please do.
Was very frustrated by that, by the Free Press article. One, because I think it mischaracterized me and my Jewish identity, but moreover, and it was wrong factually. I'm not a leader of If Not Now, and have not been involved with that organization since I was in college, which is basically a decade ago. I think that the reason why I think I ended up getting labeled an anti-Zionist was because I had made very strident criticisms of Israel and the occupation, and there was a time when making those kinds of things put you on the anti-Zionist side of the people who weren't willing to hear that kind of criticism then labeled you an anti-Zionist. And I think that I got labeled in that way for certain strident criticisms of Israel. And then now the opposite has happened, where because I believe the Jews have the collective right to self-determination, and I don't think that Israeli Jews need to leave. Now, I immediately got labeled. There's a very far left group online based in Brooklyn that labeled me and also Peter Beinart as the most offensive liberal Zionist. And that's a term that was new to be accused of being from where I had been before.
So I actually just wrote about this, and it's not out yet. It's a big piece that I wrote about the current state of what it means to be, what Zion means and what Zionism is or has been for Jews historically. And one of the things that one of my few nuggets of original thinking in this piece was that this quadrant where we think about anti-Zionism or a-Zionism or non-Zionism or diasporism, the thing that unites these people, at least in the eyes of the people that define them as other, is basically for a lot of these people, whatever my right to collective self-determination is, can't come at the expense of somebody else's right to self-determination. And that doesn't necessarily, automatically make you an anti-Zionist. That just means that it's complicated, and there's a whole spectrum of what that looks like, but united by this belief. And it sounds like what you're saying is, look, I'm not saying that I don't have the right to self-determination, I have to leave. It just means that whatever I believe it has to include other people's rights just as much as anybody else. And that's complicated, and people are looking always to categorize and to simplify. And so if you're not a Zionist and saying, I want to self-determine, I want to be on the land, then you're automatically an anti-Zionist. Yeah, I mean, there's a zero-sum quality to the discourse, and it's very hard. The gesture that I keep having to make is kind of on the one hand and on the other hand. I believe in collective self-determination for Jewish people. I also think Palestinians have the right to self-determination, exactly. And I want them and I want that right to be realized. And I don't. And there are people on the right and the left who say you have to choose one or the other. And arguing against them, especially in a time like this, is very difficult, especially against the backdrop of all the horror of the war in Gaza and all the carnage and all the suffering that we're kind of suffused with every day. There's something about Judaism that you talk about in the book that seems to resonate with me a lot. There's this sense that you talk about, there's this wholesale replacement of Jewish practice with identity and Zionism as, changing over for what used to be Judaism, which was more than just your identity and saying, I feel Jewish, Shabbat, kosher, whatever Jewish ritual, Jewish practice, Jewish communal life isn't there, but Zionist identity has shifted to replace that. What's fascinating to me is that, this new generation is rejecting this idea in favor of progressive politics, a vastly different view on Zionism for them. And many of them have come to return to Judaism. But for many, many of them, their Judaism is defined by their anti-Zionism, meaning whatever ritual they're doing, as you were talking about, like putting on a talit, right, to go to a protest, or lighting Shabbat candles at a protest, or your Jewish values are being defined by your ability to empathize with Palestinians and all the people of the world. So how does that really at the end of the day, their Judaism is still being defined by their Zionism, but in a mirror image of it?
Yes, I mean, I'm glad you brought this up, because this is in fact the subject of a chapter in the book, and what you're describing is something that I call it the diasporic double bind, and what I mean by that is that if you are living outside of Israel and you're a Jew, and whether you like it or not, you're going to get pulled into the gravitational orbit of Israel. And I found it striking as I moved in and out and reported on these progressive Jewish communities, and many of the people involved with them are friends or former friends in some cases. I was struck by the way that, for all the talk of decoupling our Jewish identity from Israel, transcending Zionism in Israel, that a lot of the anti-Zionist Jewish activism reified Israel at the center of their Jewish identities, just with the valence switch. So it's negative instead of being positive. In the book Tablet Shattered, I have a critique of this, where I think that, if it is the case that the goal for them is actually to develop a Jewish identity uncoupled from Israel or Zionism, then they have to do something a little bit different than what they're doing. Maybe it's still too early for them to have developed a more fleshed out doctrine, but there's also a lot of confusion around the question of Jewish peoplehood and Jewish collectivity. On the one hand, some of the progressive activists want, a Jewish identity politics and have a sense of Jewish collectivity. We are Jews, we're speaking on behalf of Jews. But then when it comes to, what is the relationship between our Jewish collectivity here in the diaspora and that other, also larger Jewish collectivity in Israel, it's not so clear. Are they part of the same collectivity? Is this a schismatic movement in its ambitions to really say, actually, these are two Jewish peoples, or maybe, so there's just maybe it's too early, but there's a lot of lack of clarity about these questions that I think are very important.
I think the word collectivity there is actually very important. The liberal Jewish movements historically made this shift away from Ben Adam LaMakom, basically vertical Judaism, the relationship between an individual Jew and the divine, the spiritual, the transcendent, to a Ben Adam LaMakom, right, a horizontal, collective, communal Judaism. And we see that, and the liberal Judaism is starting to realize that they need to make that shift back towards the transcendent. And what's interesting is that the Haredi community, which has been so focused on this, in some pockets have started shifting away from that and started realizing that its horizontality, the communality, needs to be there as well. Now, what I'm seeing with these anti-Zionist world is that they're coming up in a world which is purely so Ben Adam LaMakom, right? Ben Adam LaChavero, so horizontal, so communal based, so much about Tikkun Olam and all of the we're here to fix this world here, that is the only way in which they understand how to do ritual and how to do their Judaism in this, defining it in this way.
It's really interesting what you're saying, because to take it back to if you'll forgive me for taking it back to the book. So at the core of the book is an argument about I think also probably applies to Canada too, based on my time on Bathurst. Well,
we don't believe in American exceptionalism.
Yeah. and trips to Côte St. Luc. But I think that the argument that the book puts forward is that the American Jewish life came to center on three ideological pillars that crystallized after World War II. One is Americanism, and by Americanism I mean a certain kind of Jewish exceptionalism, which views America as exceptionally good, as confirmed by its treatment of Jews, both initially at home.
We just had the head of Emmett Academy come on speak last week, so we know about Jewish and American exceptionalism.
So you experienced American exceptionalism in the flesh. And the second is Zionism. And by Zionism, in the book, I actually don't mean self-determination. I mean I mean something, a certain kind of creed almost. The idea that Israel is a moral exemplar on the world stage, and also the culmination or the telos of all of Jewish existence. Like all of the last, 2,000 years were meant to culminate in this nation state. And the third is liberalism. And you'll see why I'm bringing up the pillars in a second. And liberalism, I actually don't mean political liberalism in the book. I mean an approach to liberal religion that is individual oriented. So the subject of religious practice is an individual one. The questions that orient them are like, does it feel good to me? Does it make sense to me? And the other axiom of this liberal religion is choice. It's not commitment to halakha. No one is really showing mitzvot. It's really like, because the individual is at the core, like I choose what I like and I choose what I don't like. And that's how I decide how to practice. And the third part of that is a kind of value pluralism, or even maybe verging on relativism, which is like, in this liberal framework, I can't give reasons for why I do one thing or the other, or why one way is better than the other. It works for me and I choose to do it. And you might do something else, but I can't tell you your way is bad. And my argument in the book is that more than the communality that you're describing, I didn't find there to be so much communality or in the landscape when I reported on it. What I found was that there was a lot of subjective individual meaning searching that was happening, which is also important, but that other elements of traditional Jewish life, like community, like obligation of mitzvah itself, had sort of fallen away. And in the book, a chapter on liberal Judaism is juxtaposed to a chapter on Haredi life. And, as I see it, even though this is changing, and then this is also something the book takes up, Haredi life has been built on very different axioms and very different pillars than mainstream or mainline affiliated Judaism. And that's partially why it seems, a little more vibrant, or certainly more demographically robust than the liberal streams.
So there's something I wanted to ask, because you were discussing with Emily Basil on the sort of, was it micro-sociology, or was that the word?
Yeah.
I'm wondering, though, about something I've noticed in the American and maybe to some extent Canadian Jewish community, where people who grew up in more sort of tight-knit, uniformly Zionist Jewish communities are, in my anecdotal experience, very overrepresented in this sort of left-wing, either anti-Zionist or deeply critical of Israel, but not outright anti-Zionist spheres. Whereas people with backgrounds like mine, I mean, it's all over the place, but it's more that, like, I think I saw a lot of anti-Semitism in daily life. I got a good look at how non-Jews see Jews long before October 7th. And that meant that, like, I read Herzl, and that a lot resonated when I got to that, like, at university, you know what I mean? So, like, I also was very exposed to, like, criticisms of Israel just from people I knew. It wasn't like and I never had that, like, aha, oh my goodness, Israel can do things that are bad epiphany that it seems like a lot of people do. So what I'm wondering is, I'm one person, you're one person, Emily Bazelon is one person. Does any of this point to anything bigger or no?
So I think my answer to the question is kind of, it's a both and.
Sure.
And what I mean by that, to get to the microsociology, is I think it's certainly true that people who have from backgrounds that are more similar to mine, say like day school background, roughly as a stand-in, are very visibly represented as public figures or leaders of some of these movements. But I actually don't think that experience is represented in the rank and file of the movements. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is that one of the most interesting things I saw as I reported on the book was that there are a lot of people who are attracted to the social movements because they're looking for an expression of Jewish identity that they weren't able to find previously. I ran a progressive Jewish organization in college. I used to joke with the other person I ran it with that Chabad should be paying us under the table for doing Kiruv because we were or bringing people closer because we were reaching out to Jews who never would have stepped inside of Hillel for reasons that maybe they felt intimidated or they didn't feel like they had sufficient knowledge, but they were willing to come to our little get together where we like read a few lines from the Torah or the Gemara about like social justice and discussed them in a very non-judgmental circle. And there was a huge demand for that. And I think that's still true. In other words, there are a lot of people who want to have a deeper, more meaningful Jewish practice and identity, they also have really strong progressive political commitments that they don't find represented in most of the like the mainstream institutions. And so it leads them to look elsewhere. I mean, that's something that has always struck me, that like what I took as, oh, this is the political use of ritual in order to dramatize the protest. Like that ritual also has religious, spiritual meaning for the people doing it, who maybe never grew up with Shabbat candles or didn't have meaningful Passover Seders, but now they're doing that, and that for the first time in their lives.
But I guess these are not people who came across or were particularly bothered by sort of daily life anti-Semitism.
I don't know. I can't. Okay. I think that how to analyze and understand anti-Semitism is like one of the greatest intellectual challenges facing, thinking people right now, and how to make sense of what's happening. On the one, I think people have certainly experienced anti-Semitism, but then again, it's hard to know where that experience, like just because you experience anti-Semitism, it's not for a foregone conclusion where might take you politically.
Of course.
I want to use that to pivot actually to what's been going on this week in Israel. There was the discovery of six hostages that had just previously been killed. It led to massive public protests, the likes of which we hadn't seen since at least a year ago, pre-October 7th. And the tone and nature of the discourse in Israel doesn't seem to be mirrored with what's going on in America right now. Phoebe and I have a difference of opinion. I guess that's a micro-sociology right there of where this is going and what this is. But one of the senses that I get is that this strong critique of the current government or government in general, whenever it's warranted in Israel, is much easier to do because anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism aren't as closely linked, in that you can critique the government and don't feel like, you're going to open yourself up to saying, well, you're an anti-Semite because you are anti-Zionist or whatever it is. And I think that that's very true in America, where you have to press somebody sometimes to get to the point where they'll say, well, yes, I'm critical of the Bibi government, but I really want to support Israel and I'm a staunch Zionist. But, all the caveats that are there really exist, I think, because of this fear of potentially being anti-Zionist. What's going on in Israel right now, and why is it not being mirrored in America? I guess is a short question to the longer preamble that I just went through.
That's a great question. I mean, I think the biggest breakdown or gap between what in Israel and the U.S. on this has been the meaning of a ceasefire. And in Israel, the demand for a ceasefire is coupled with the return of the hostages. And so when people go out and say, and it's not so much that in Israel and the protests are using the term ceasefire, they're using more of the terms a deal. But that's the meaning of what they're saying. They're going and protesting and saying like iska, which is the deal. That's what they want. In America, the issue of the hostages became right coded, and it also happened to be that the ceasefire demand got in some ways decoupled from the hostages. And so you have kind of the strange spectacle of protesters on the, let's say progressive left. I don't like calling them the progressive left sometimes, because I'm like, well, if there's a protest with a Hamas flag flying, like this isn't the progressive left. This is something else. But we don't like we still don't have the terminology yet. And then so they'll be chanting, something along the lines of ending the war, and across from them will be pro-Israel protesters will be chanting, bring them home. And it's one of these things where, because American reality in or outside of Israel, everything becomes abstract and a little bit decoupled from things on the ground, there's been this split.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I've wondered about, just because I'm coming at this from the perspective of somebody who lives in a part of Toronto where there are signs that say the neighborhood for Free Palestine, like lining the street, like every business for a while pretty much had one. And ceasefire in this context has definitely meant something different, it seems like, from what you're talking about. And I've wondered if there is, and maybe this is just me being in Canada now, I'm from New York City originally, but is there any kind of like signage or visual sort of iconography or something like it feels like this is just absent from North American Jewish public life, or not just Jewish, like this position that exists obviously en masse in Israel is just kind of absent visually.
Yeah, I mean, I think that has to do also with the dynamics of the relationship between progressive Israelis and diaspora Jewish communities. And what I mean by that is that the progressive camp in Israel is very secular, it's very lefty liberal, and there aren't, especially now, there aren't a lot of really good connections between American and American Jewish activists, whether they're in, the mainstream Jewish community or in the progressive side, and Israeli activists who are calling for the hostage deal. There is, the hostage families movement has very striking visual iconography. They also happen to be in Hebrew. And I think that that's part of what has gotten lost in translation. Like, it's very, very Israeli, the movement. I mean, in New York and city, there's a weekly gathering of kind of Israelis and similar-minded people who are calling for who do their own protest for a deal and a ceasefire in Union Square. That's not part of they wouldn't be welcomed into the more radical protest anyway, because they're Israelis and Zionists, but it's basically like a liberal Zionist protest of sorts. And there you do see some of the slogans and some of the T-shirts from the hostage family. I understand some of the reticence that people have to making strident criticism in a time where it's easy to feel besieged by like venomous hatred of Jews. But I am also very disappointed that in the leadership of the mainstream institutions, where it seems to me like they chose not to listen to the demands of the families. And I think this crystallized most with the death of Hirsch Goldberg Polin, whose family spoke at the DNC and who could have been brought home if there had been a deal. And on the one hand, I felt like American Jewish organizations were really quick to use his family and use his family's story and their materials, but they also weren't willing to push Israel and the Netanyahu government to come closer to a deal. And that's to me, that's tragic. And it's more than tragic. It's infuriating, because like the lives of Hirsch and those other hostages maybe could have been saved if Jewish organizations had been more willing to put pressure or to enable the U.S. and other governments to put pressure on the Netanyahu government to reach a deal.
Sort of, I guess it's like the purple circle is the emoji on Twitter that like indicates this sort of position. Is that right?
Yeah. So the purple circle comes from a group called Standing Together, Omdim B'Yachad, which is this joint Jewish Arab movement in Israel, and it's kind of emerged very inspiringly as like one of the major forces of dissent and public protest, and they're very good at organizing things.
Mm-hmm. So what I was wondering is just, it was in terms of a way forward, because I think as somebody who wants roughly purple circle things to happen, but feels like I could not join up in any meaningful sense with the Canadian left on any of this, because they want Israel wiped from the map, as far as I can tell, but I'm not for Netanyahu either. What is the way forward to kind of promote what you write about in The Atlantic of like everybody stays put, everybody has self-determination? How does that message get across? Because I think a lot of people want that, but like, it's not a yard sign currently. You know what I mean? Like not in North America, at least not in my bit of it. How does that change? What should I put in my yard?
I mean, I think you should put that in your yard.
A rambling thing I said on a podcast.
I think that it's very hard to stand and be in the middle of two very viciously opposed camps on this. And it's funny that you mentioned the Atlantic article, and I felt like the article ended on what is a very banal point, or should be a banal point, in that Jews and Palestinians both have a right to live with equality, dignity, and freedom, and no one is going anywhere. Like, very baseline. And then people on both sides got angry. There are people on the right who are have attacked me for saying like, no, it's only belongs to the Jews, and how could you have Rahmanis on these people, and like that's horrifying to me. And then there's also a kind of left-wing position that this is settler colonialism and we're going to decolonize Palestine. And the line that people have taken has sort of been like, well, Jews can stay, but they'll have to become un-Israeli in some sense. And that's obviously not a genuine. It's not genuine when people say that, nor in the same way it's not genuine when people on the Israeli right say, oh, when we annex all of the occupied territories, the Palestinians can stay as long as they like give up their national aspiration. It's not actually an honest thing. I think that though for a lot of people, taking this position means getting attacked and being called names, and that's not very fun. But I'm speaking for myself. Like for a long time, I was really reluctant to kind of come out and just write what I actually was saying in private to my wife and to other people who are close to me. Like it did take me time in order to feel like it's really necessary to say these things, even if it's going to mean being ejected from polite Brooklyn literary society, which is like a small price actually to pay. On the one hand, I think if enough people just start saying it, that does make a difference. I do believe that people power matters. I also think that this is a place where pushing on communal Jewish institutions also is important. Part of why things are hard is that communal Jewish institutions also aren't willing to say this line. And the people who represent Jews publicly also aren't willing as much to make a commitment to equality for everyone. Umdim Biachad doesn't always get a warm welcome from mainstream Jewish institutions. And, there are organizations that I think do walk this line. J Street is an example of one, although I think J Street in the US is a little bit hamstrung by the fact that they do a lot of Capitol Hill work. And so they can't be a kind of like prophetic moral voice because they have to do behind the scenes things. And that requires kind of it's a complicated political dance. But I resonate with what you're saying. And I actually think that most Jews actually want this. There's just no one speaking.
And there's also a lot of people who don't care what Jews want, but that's a yes. I mean, exactly. I would happily, if I could find it and had the artistic sense, I would put your Atlantic article quote on a yard sign and yes. Encourage all the local businesses where I live to do the same. But here's hoping.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. This has been great.
Thank you so much. Yeah, for having me. It was really great talking with you. Really appreciate it.
I can't date women right now because I'm too busy calling myself a piece of shit.
I had a dysfunctional Jewish mother and I had a dysfunctional Native mother.
I had 25 full years of utter struggle and failure.
I started to realize the absurdity of my inability to let go of this monster of guilt.
Sounds like fun, doesn't it? Hi, I'm Ralph Benrig. I'm the host of Not That Kind of Rabbi, where we look at people's spiritual journeys and take a little time for their self-reflection, and maybe yours. You can get it all at thecjn.ca/NTKR or wherever you get your podcasts.
All right, let's get to our Nachas, Broigus. Phoebe, you have a Nachas? Do you have a Broigus?
I do. I have a Nachas, and I'm going to recommend an article that a friend of mine wrote, somebody I went to college with and knew very well at one point through blogging. So this is ancient history. Rita Kogenzone. Dr. Kogenzone is an associate professor in the School of Civic Life and Leadership at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. I did not know that was her current title, but anyway, that's exciting. Anyway, she wrote a guest essay, so an opinion essay for the New York Times called An Infantilizing Double Standard for American College Students. And it's a great piece about sort of the way it's come to pass that if you are a young adult who happens to go to college, especially a more elite college, you're kind of in this weird limbo status where you're treated kind of like a child, whereas somebody who is just, a 20-year-old with a job is not. And how this isn't necessarily a good thing for everybody. And she gets into stuff to do with the protests and all of this. She is Jewish herself. It's not a case against students protesting. It's more of a case against universities promising a type of safe space that, as she gets into in the piece, is not possible to promise to multiple groups with competing interests. So super interesting essay. She's one of the smartest people I've ever met. We don't always agree on politics. That's fine. You should always read her. She's good. So yeah, that's my recommendation.
I will check it out.
What have
Absolutely.
you got?
What have I got? I've got a nachas. Today is the first day of Elul. It is the month leading up to Rosh Hashanah. And I've noticed this year for sure, even though it's the first day, and in a past couple of years, that for those who take the idea of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and the high holidays and Day of Atonement and Day of, resetting the clock and thinking about the coming year and the past year, seriously, Elul is like a really serious month. It's a real month where people treat it really seriously and get introspective, make Facebook posts about how to be introspective, or send out emails to their lists. And the gathering up of thinking about Elul and thinking about Rosh Hashanah is very different, I find, than Passover, which, it tends to be about the chametz and the food, and we sort of add that spiritual element on top of it. But this really feels qualitatively different, and I really appreciate it around this time of the year. Thank you for listening to Bonjour Chai for the week ending September 7th, Shabbat Parashat Shoftim. The show is produced by Michael Fraiman and edited by Zach Kauffman. The executive producer for CJN Podcast is Michael Fraiman. Our music is by So-Called. We are a project of the Jewish Living Lab and are distributed by the CJN Podcast Network. You can listen to all our past episodes on our page at thecjn.ca/bonjour, and you can subscribe to the podcast and automatically receive all episodes on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. We would love it if you told a friend about Bonjour Chai. It is one of the best ways we get new listeners. As always, you can email us with comments at bonjour@thecjn.ca. So I'm not going to say thank you. Not a great episode. I'm going to leave that behind.
I would like you to leave that in. That would be hilarious.